I'm Roger Berkowitz, and welcome to the Hannah Arendt Center's virtual reading group. Today, we are starting to read Hannah Arendt's essay collection, Between Past and Future. This is one of the major essay collections in her writing. Many of these essays are some of the best works she did. A lot of them were published originally in journals like The New Yorker and the New York Review of Books, but they are, as she will describe later, exercises in thinking and in specifically political thinking. And she introduces these essays with a preface called The Gap Between Past and Future. And one of the things that's often forgotten, I think, is that these essays are put together in a book by her, and she thinks they go together. Even though each essay may have been written individually and they're on different themes: what is freedom, education, the crisis in culture, space and science, the break in tradition, she sees them as in some ways part of a coherent whole. And this preface is her attempt to unite them. It is probably one of the most beautiful and poetic pieces of writing we have from Hannah Preface. The gap between past and future. It's largely an interpretation of a series of metaphors and parables, and it itself is an attempt to offer an extended metaphor, and that makes it hard to talk about, and yet I also think worthwhile and fascinating to talk about. The extended metaphor of the entire preface is the gap between past and future, and the gap comes to stand metaphorically for the space for thinking. This gap between past and future is where man can and does think. And she approaches the gap through a number of stories and parables. The first one is the recounting of some poetry by the French poet and then resistance fighter René Char. And she starts the book with a quotation from him that in translation reads, "Our inheritance was left to us by no testament." What is she trying to talk about? What is our inheritance that was left to us by no testament? It is in many ways what she here will call the treasure, the lost treasure. And this lost treasure is freedom. René Char was a poet, and then during the war, the World War II, he, with many others, joined the resistance and fought. And in this fighting, in joining the resistance, he found himself, she says, and many others did as well. She says on page 4 that he ceased to be in quest of himself without mastery, in naked unsatisfaction, that he no longer suspected himself of insincerity. This ability to go naked, to be transparent, to not be doubting ourselves, to be fighting for a cause, to be believing in that cause. But it wasn't just that you were fighting against tyranny, because a lot of soldiers were doing that. It was that he was fighting with others freely. And in doing so, she says, they became challengers, had taken the initiative upon themselves, and therefore, without knowing or even noticing it, had begun to create that public space between themselves where freedom could appear. So somehow the first of these stories or parables is René Char and these other freedom fighters fighting, challenging, and allowing freedom to appear. She then in the second story or metaphorical parable, she talks about how this experience was common to not only people in the European resistance, but all revolutionaries. And she says the history of revolutions from the summer of 1776 in Philadelphia and the summer of 1789 in Paris to the autumn of 1956 in Budapest, which politically spells out the innermost story of the modern age, could be told in parable form as the tale of an age-old treasure, which, under the most varied circumstances, appears abruptly, unexpectedly, and disappears again under different mysterious conditions, as though it were a fata morgana. This treasure that when you're fighting in the resistance with others and challenging, and when you're in a revolutionary situation, you experience a kind of freedom, the freedom of unknowing what the future is, what will happen, of a challenger, of being a revolutionary, of starting something new. And this is something, this is an experience that in many ways, in different books, through philosophy and thinking, Hannah Arendt is fascinated by. What does it mean to be in this experience, in this moment of possibility, of newness, of spontaneity that was unexpected? And she says, these things, it may be a mirage that this treasure ever existed. Maybe there is no such thing. And yet, people like René Char, people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who she talks about a lot in her book On Revolution, they felt it and they wrote about it, often in very poetic and metaphorical terms. They called it public freedom and public happiness, according to Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And René Char talked about it as his lost treasure. And she begins this preface then with this idea of this sort of lost treasure of freedom, this experience of freedom that some people have had at times. And she asks, how can we name it or maybe hold on to it? We have no heritage. We have no, as she says, it was no testament. It wasn't given to us. How do we take it back? How do we re-find it? And she says on page 5, about 4 lines into the paragraph that begins on page 5, without testament, or to resolve the metaphor, without tradition, there seems to be no willed continuity in time, and hence, humanly speaking, neither past nor future, only sempiternal change of the world and a biological cycle of living creatures in it. And so this metaphor of a testament that we don't have is also is now resolved in the sense of that we're without tradition, that we don't have the that freedom and the institutions of freedom, which happen in this fata morgana that happens and goes away and happens and goes away, isn't bound in and created in and kept in traditions that we can hold on to. She says a little bit lower down that remembrance is absolutely essential for us to have any kind of political meaning. For remembrance, which is only one of the most important modes of thought, is helpless outside a pre-established framework of reference. So without a testament or a tradition, without institutions, without a way of talking about this revolutionary freedom, this challenge, we can't really hold on to it. And this is what she's writing about, is how can we today bring freedom to be? And she says that it happens in these moments, but we don't have the space to make it real. On page 6, she writes, there is nothing in this situation that is altogether new. We are only too familiar with the recurring outbursts of passionate exasperation with reason, thought, and rational discourse, which are the natural reactions of men who know from their own experiences that thought and reality have parted company, that reality has become opaque for the light of thought, and that thought, no longer bound to incident as the circle remains bound to its focus, is liable either to become altogether meaningless or to rehash old verities which have lost all concrete relevance. The point here is that we want to hold on to this reality, this feeling, and yet thought and reality have, in a meaningful way, parted company. That we don't have the words, we don't have the ability to name this experience. We can simply create or make. We've come to realize that our ability to think is not consummate to reality. Reality is more complicated, messier, more difficult, less predictable than our reason. And this poses the problem of how we can meaningfully hold on to and think in a way that is meaningful and real in the world. There's no, in a sense, testament or space for this kind of free thinking and freedom that Shar and the revolutionaries had experienced. She then turns to this parable by Franz Kafka. She spends years thinking about this parable. It appears in this text. She writes about it in letters. She writes about it in her book, The Life of the Mind, which she never finished and was the last book she was writing about. There are numerous entries on it in her Denktagebuch. This parable of he is one of the most important and clearly one of the most fertile and fecund texts that she addresses in her work. You can read it. It's on page 7. I'm not going to read the entirety of the parable. But the essential characters are that there's the past as a force, and there's the future as a force, and they both start infinitely from the infinite past and the infinite future, and connect at this moment at a he, and he is pressed from behind and from in front by the past and the future. And Arendt presents this parable and then does a lot with it. And so the first thing she says is that it is a parable of thinking, of the mind. It's a parable of the space of thought. And she cites Hegel on page 7, and it's worth taking a look at this. She says, the task of the mind is to understand what happened, and this understanding, according to Hegel, is man's way of reconciling himself with reality. Its actual end is to be at peace with the world. The end of thinking, for Hegel, is reconciliation. It's to be at peace. It's to reconcile spirit, mind, with reality. And that's what Hegel, as a scientific thinker, wants to do, is make the crazy, messy reality clear in thought, and also use thought to make the crazy, messy reality clear. But Arendt addresses this dream of Hegel, this reconciliatory dream, in many of her works. And over again, she says, we're no longer at that stage where we can reconcile thought and reality. And so here she continues, the trouble is that if the mind is unable to bring peace and to induce reconciliation, it finds itself immediately engaged in its own kind of warfare. And this is what she thinks Kafka's parable represents, the warfare of a mind that can't bring peace to reality. We live at a time in which we have for Arendt lost the ability to understand the world in a way that makes sense. The world is the old confidence that God created a rational world, or that science could create and understand a rational world, is gone. And so that this effort to think and understand the world is now seen as a battle. And the battle metaphors throughout this 13, 14 page section are intense. There's an attempt to battle, to make sense of a world, a reality that is no longer sensible to thought. And this leads her to worry, or to wonder that the human mind, as she says, this is the bottom of page 8, the discovery that the human mind has ceased for some mysterious reasons to function properly forms, so to speak, the first act of the story with which we are concerned here. The human mind no longer can truly adequately represent and understand the reality of the world. And she thinks that Kafka's parable is in a sense addressing that. And that's sort of the first stage of the parable. She then, at the bottom of page 10 and into 11, she says, without distorting Kafka's meaning. So now we're moving beyond what I think she thinks is the obvious reading of the parable, and saying, without distorting Kafka's meaning, I think one may go a step further. Kafka describes how the insertion of man breaks up the unidirectional flow of time. But strangely enough, he does not change the traditional image. So it's still straight lines, right? And Kafka says in the parable that man wants to jump up above the where the places where the lines meet, and sort of be in a timeless, spaceless, super sensuous realm, as the realm proper to thought, which is sort of what she thinks of as the Hegelian idea of man as umpire, where we stand outside of the battle and look at it, and with a purely rational mind make sense of it. And then she continues, and this is to me where it really gets important and interesting. Obviously, she says, what is missing in Kafka's description of a thought event, what is missing is a spatial dimension where thinking could exert itself without being forced to jump out of human time altogether. Where thinking doesn't jump up to be an umpire outside of human time as sort of this rational, supersensuous umpire. But is there a space where thinking, she says, without jumping up out of human time, could still think and reflect on this battle while still being in this human time? And that is what she is referring to as this gap between past and future, as this spatial dimension where thinking could exert itself without jumping out of human time. It remains tied to humanity. And she then says in the next paragraph, ideally, the action of the two forces, so past and future, which meet at man and create what's the physics calls the parallelogram of forces. So the two forces meet, and an angle comes up in the middle, starting from man. She says, the two forces which form the parallelogram of forces, where Kafka's he has found his battlefield, should result in a third force, the resultant diagonal, whose origin would be the point at which the forces clash and upon which they act. And so man is this beginning, and we know for her from Augustine that man is a beginner. Man is free in the sense that he can start something new. And the point is that it's in this space where thinking can exert itself, where past and future interact, where man can start a new force, a third force. And then she describes this third force a little further down, about 5 lines from the bottom of this page, page 11. The diagonal force, this third force that begins with man. The diagonal force would be limited as to its origin, namely man, its starting point being the clash of the antagonistic forces, but it would be infinite with respect to its ending by virtue of having resulted from the concerted action of two forces whose origin is infinity. This diagonal force that begins with the antagonism at man, whose origin is known, whose direction is determined by past and future, but whose eventual end lies in infinity, is the perfect metaphor for the activity of thought. And this is what this preface is an attempt to offer, a metaphor for the activity of thought. It's in this human space, this space not jumping out of human time, where thinking can exert itself, where man can in some way create a new force, a freedom, a space of freedom and thinking. She thinks that this is not a new phenomena. It's not a modern phenomena, she says at the top of 13. And she thinks it's probably as old as the existence of man. And this is important for her. At most times in human history, the vast majority of man and men and women and people do not live in this gap. They don't think. And she says, for the most part, this gap has been bridged over by what, since the Romans, we have called tradition. This is on the middle of page 13. So the idea here is that tradition provides us with institutions and habits and ways of life that largely prevent us from having to live in this battlefield of forces. And while there were always thinkers, philosophers, poets, artists who broke through tradition and lived in this battlefield, lived in this gap, most of us haven't. And that, she says, is the normal condition of man. Normal, the historical tradition of man, not normal. But she says that the situation we're in today, and that Kafka is describing, is a situation in which the loss of tradition, the breakdown of tradition, has led to the fact that more and more of us can no longer simply orient our lives through traditions and institutions that we take for granted. And as this tradition has worn thinner, she writes, thinner and thinner, as the modern age progressed, she says this is not a secret to anyone. And when the thread of tradition finally broke, the gap between past and future ceased to be a condition peculiar only to the activity of thought, and restricted as an experience to those few who made thinking their primary business. It became a tangible reality and perplexity for all. That is, it became a fact of political relevance. And now I think we're at where this essay collection emerges. Politics today is no longer a question of bringing thought to reality and imposing the clarity and truthfulness of thought on reality. We live in a world in which there is no political truth. And so she says at the bottom of 13 to 14, the following 8 essays are exercises in thinking. And their only aim is to gain experience in how to think. They do not contain prescriptions on what to think or which truths to hold. Least of all do they intend to retie the broken thread of tradition, or to invent some newfangled surrogates with which to fill the gap between past and future. Throughout these exercises, the problem of truth is kept in abeyance. The concern is solely with how to move in this gap, the only region perhaps where truth eventually will reappear. And so these essays are attempts to think as exercises in how politically thinking needs to keep truth in abeyance. We need to understand that we live in an age in which the attempts to impose truth on reality are always suspect. The attempts to say, even if we don't have a metaphysical truth, that truth is given by traditions are also suspect because the traditions have broken. There are multiple traditions, and which tradition we pick is not obvious and is always a political answer. And yet we then are faced with a choice. Is it all politics? Is it all power? Is it all violence? Or is there a way and a place for thinking amidst this chaos, amidst the new reality of the broken tradition? And these essays are attempts to think in that gap, to teach us, to habituate us in the habit and practice and experience of thinking amidst this gap. So we will talk about this, and as we read through the rest of this book, keep this in mind as the effort of these essays to habituate us to thinking. I look forward to talking to you. Thank you very much.